All right, well, we're going to move right on to our final panel of the event today, and this is a panel focusing on issues in measuring innovation and value. While everyone up here is getting mic'd up, I want to make just a few introductory remarks to connect what we're doing on this panel to what you've been hearing about so far this morning. You've already heard a lot about the importance of measuring performance of medical care and performance of the key technologies involved in delivering better health to patients. In particular, this started out with Newt Gingrich's remarks this morning about pushing towards a mechanism for learning much more and much more quickly from the actual delivery of care and from a transformed approach to the development of medical technologies. You heard from people on the first panel like Scott Gottlieb of the importance of, if we are moving in this direction, of payments tied more to the results of medical technologies, that good measures of the outcomes associated with those technologies and the impact of those technologies on outcomes are needed, especially for long-term outcomes. You heard just on the last panel about how important it is to have this information in a way that is collected both efficiently and includes relevant measures both of outcomes and impacts on costs. That's something that Reed was very passionate about. Hervé on the last panel emphasized the point about making sure that we're paying attention to individualization of these treatments and their use as well. So that creates a lot of challenges for measurement in bringing all of these kinds of reforms to bear, as well as developing the evidence that can guide treatment decisions using a vast array of more personalized technologies more effectively. And that's what we want to focus on in this panel. How are we going about measuring the value of innovative technologies, particularly in more individualized applications? Is our current infrastructure doing in supporting those efforts? Our electronic data systems, or lack thereof, our methods for collecting information on medical technologies both before and after they're approved and out in use, and how can we make more progress in these areas? We've got another very diverse and distinguished panel this morning to help us discuss these issues. Our presenters include Uday Kumar, who's the founder and chief medical officer of iRhythm Technologies, Vicky Margolis, who's the senior advisor for science, innovation, and policy for the Food and Drug Administration, Lou Garrison, who's a professor in pharmaceutical outcomes research and policy in the Department of Pharmacy and an adjunct professor in the Departments of Global Health and Health Services at the University of Washington, and Sean Tunis, who's the founder and director of the Center for Medical Technology Policy. So as we've done in the last panels, we're going to start by asking the people with me on stage today to make a few opening comments, and then we're going to turn this into a discussion about these issues related to measuring value in medical innovation. So let me start with Uday. When you founded iRhythm Technologies, Uday, I know your explicit goal was to develop medical technologies that not just improved health, but that also saved money, and you had an explicit goal in the process of being able to measure how that was occurring. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that experience and the implications for what we're talking about today.
Great, thanks for having me. I think as a representative of a startup, as a founder of a startup, I think the challenges faced by startup companies are very different than what you might have heard from the larger companies. So let me just paint the clinical vignette to start so you understand what we do. So if you're a patient who might feel lightheaded or palpitations, your heart fluttering, you'll probably go about your day thinking it's nothing. At some point, you may go see your primary care doctor who will say, well, you look fine now, let's watch what happens. If you go to an emergency room, let's say, they may say, well, you look fine right now, the symptoms come and gone, come back again if it happens again. And you'll go through this process multiple times, and eventually, potentially, finally get to your primary care who will refer you to a specialist, like myself as a cardiologist. I would order a test, I get paid for that test, but those tests may only cover you and monitor you for a day or two, and you have your symptoms every few days or a week. So I wouldn't find anything. So that would be more time passes. Then you'd get another test that might be longer. And these tests typically are like the microphone I'm wearing, a pager with wires. It's very hard to comply with. So you want to wear it for several weeks, you don't. So we don't find what happens. But again, I as a physician get paid for that test. So this process continues and continues, and finally, you'll eventually get a test that may prove or not prove that you have an abnormal heart rhythm as the cause of your symptom. Now, anyone would see that that's kind of a crazy system from a patient standpoint, because what do patients want? They want to be diagnosed when they're first seen. So we realize that there's a big gap here of how can you make the system more efficient by focusing on value as actually a requirement in developing a new technology. So what we developed was really a simple little patch. All it does is stick to your body for up to 14 days while you sleep and shower with it. It's disposable. It can be put on in an emergency room or by the primary care doctor. And the whole idea is that it gives you enough time, it's highly compliant, and patients can use it and get an answer. So we wanted to figure out, can we obviate multiple tests as an indicator of cost, as well as reduce cost of the initial test to get to the same outcome? So that's what we do. And in a nutshell, we realized that value and innovation were actually things that we could use to promote ourselves and actually were a benefit to what we're doing. So what have I learned? I think two or three things that are really important from the small company entrepreneurial standpoint. And again, I'm happy to say as small company innovator, we have created 130 US jobs. We're we're being sold all over the country, but we have to underwrite what we do. While we can comply with some existing codes, there is no thing for exactly what we do right now. So what's important is that companies and payers expect companies to raise tens of millions, of hundreds of millions of dollars to fund the usage of their products once through the FDA. While big companies may have the luxury of doing that, the funding environment is much more challenging these days for funders, venture capitalists, even corporates, to put in that money. So that is a real stifler of innovation. So one of the first things I've learned is little companies have to raise lots of money to actually prove that they're a benefit. Second thing I've learned is payers need to be potentially involved. I mean, we would love to go to payers early and say, like, look, we can model what we're doing, but you have to accept that modeling may be all we can do. We can't wait 3 years to prove what we do, because we'll be out of business by then. So then you can say, we'll pay for you, but you're not paying for anything since we don't exist anymore. That doesn't work. And again, since little companies are the drivers of a lot of innovations that really big companies also buy up, this is end creator of US jobs, it is important to think about payers having a stake in the game, that if we can come to some model of what's a reasonable approach to modeling what we do, that, okay, let's all risk share. I mean, risk sharing is more like, I've gone through the FDA, I have an approved product. Now help me pay for it. And if I keep proving my outcomes, just like milestones to a VC, to get to a regulatory approval, why can't there be milestones for achieving certain clinical outcomes that can translate to cost? The third thing is payers have data. They say they want data from companies. I'm, as a little company, say I want your data. You know the historical context and the cost of what it costs you to pay for a disease state over time. So payers need to understand that cost is not measured on an annual beneficiary cycle, but over the lifetime of a patient. And it may be different for diagnostics versus therapeutics. So if I could have access to the data and I say, this is the outcome I'm trying to get to, I at least know what I'm up against. I know what I can price to make it interesting to you such that you would want to help me pay for this early phase, and if I hit something, you pay a little more, hit something, pay a little more, so that we're all going in the same direction. But I don't have the money to pay for a pharmaceutical, pay lots of money to consultants to look at Medicare databases, so that's difficult. The final thing would be, how do we put this in a framework? So I'm trying to think about, in some of the other efforts I do, how would we simplify this process so that everyone can think similarly? Well, I really think about it, there's 4 things that most things fit into. Acute diagnostics, which may reduce events to get to a certain outcome like what I do. There's chronic diagnostics, like maybe glucose monitoring every day. Then there's acute therapeutics, implantation of a stent or an ICD or a knee implant, or chronic therapeutics, like taking a drug every day or getting dialysis every day. 4 different big buckets that reasonably cover most things, and if we can understand what are the outcomes for each over the course of a patient's lifetime for that disease state based on historical data that payers have on the cost of that historical data, maybe there could be some alignment of what I need to do from a pricing perspective, as well as what payers will be willing to pay early on to support getting these innovations that ultimately benefit them. And then finally, one of the other hats I wear at Stanford is teaching this process of innovation in a global context with other countries, India, Singapore. Now, what I've seen is those countries can not only create products just as good as ours, but they do so and have done so for a long time thinking about cost, because they're different societies. So if we want to remain globally competitive, it's not only thinking about creating value for our own citizens, but med tech is one of the biggest exporters of products outside of the US. It's a huge exporter. We will fast become an importer if we don't try to figure out ways to reduce the barriers for innovators, entrepreneurs, small companies to be able to survive a tough funding environment. It's just not feasible to expect millions and millions of dollars to be raised to prove something that everyone can agree is intuitively potentially obvious, but how can we come to some agreement along the way in a simplified way that everybody can work towards?
Uday, thank you. And turn to Vicky next. So we've heard about this issue of how measurement can play an important role in bringing valuable products along more quickly and effectively. From an individual company standpoint, it can be very hard to come up with those systems for measurement. At FDA, I know you're working on a number of approaches that are designed to improve that infrastructure, both before products come to market and when they're in actual use. Maybe you could talk some about that.
So I just wanted to open by saying I am a scientist, and I still really believe in the power of science and technology to be transformative. And I spent the 10 years of my life prior to joining the FDA actually doing biomarker discovery and working to find ways to promote and do personalized medicine in an academic clinical trials consortia. I want to come back a little bit to where we started, where the former speaker started, and talk about what I think is a complex ecosystem that clearly could be transformed by, I think, a few key things that will answer many questions. And most of it relies on sharing information and community building. So if we look at the picture in academia, the incentives that currently exist in terms of as an academic scientist are not about team-based research, and they're clearly not product-focused. And if you look at what's going on and you really start to dissect where is the innovation coming from in academia, it's not in large part. There's a lot of iterative science going on. There's a lot of funding of the same kinase. If you look at kinases, which are hot molecules, many of them that are being worked on today and supported are the same ones that have been worked on since the 1990s. We need to move out of this. The genome has given us 500 promising kinases. We're working on about 20. So that's the first thing. How do we get there? I think sharing information. Biotech and pharma clearly have issues with globalized markets, horizontal integration models that need to be moved to more in-licensing and more interesting and diverse structures. An issue with patenting right now, where they're on a patent cliff with a significant loss of revenue. Duplication of failure. So the same thing I'm talking about in academia. Everybody's working on the same 10 kinases in academia. Everybody's working on the same 10 kinases in industry. And if it's not working and we see it come in the door, we're not able to tell Pfizer that we saw this 10 times before and why we think it's not a good pathway. Sharing information could really help drive down costs by reducing duplication of failure. And I have some dollar figures about a current target, TRPV1, which is a pain receptor, where you can look at about a $460 million investment right now in pharma. We're only in phase 1 and about 12 companies essentially doing very similar things. Okay, medical device companies, I think they present unique challenges because of some of the things that were articulated. Small business has a very different set of concerns, very different set of needs. And again, I think one of their challenges is navigating the regulatory and reimbursement environment. And I also think sharing information could help promote better outcomes in that sector. I'll try to be quick. Payers, of course, we've heard a lot about that. Physicians, this is clearly a huge issue, and particularly for the diagnostic companies because they rely on adoption by physicians in order to actually get their product out there. Physicians, clearly a huge issue when we think about personalized medicine. They don't know what's on the label. They don't know how to practice with drug diagnostic combinations. We have to get the information out to them in ways that they can really use it. Patients, I think, are key consideration. There's a lot of discussion now about the regulatory uncertainty. I happen to think a large part of that is scientific uncertainty. We need to invest in practical science. We're calling it regulatory science. You can call it whatever you like. It's the valley of death between discovery and product. We need investment there. It's not something an individual sponsor is going to do. It's got to be done collectively. We at the FDA think we have an important role to play in bringing together companies, academia, and ourselves in a new kind of public-private partnership model where we can begin to address some of these big questions, like predictive tox. Predictive tox is going to be essential to shifting that ROI curve, driving down cost of medical product development, and allowing companies to move into niche markets for personalized medicine. But let's get back to the patients. They're getting lost in this equation. They don't know what they're supposed to do, and I think in an information-rich society, and what we're seeing are sites like Patients Like Me bubble up, we've got to get accurate information out there so that they're an informed consumer and part of their healthcare equation. And then finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing that we think are very innovative for a regulatory agency along the lines of sharing information. So we're involved in a project to establish public-private partnerships around our pre-market data. We view this as an enormous asset that's an untapped, really gold mine of information about all the drugs and medical products that have ever come into the agency, whether they failed or whether they succeeded. We understand that that's confidential information. We understand that there's a lot of very tightly guarded company secrets. We also understand there's a lot of really important information in there that we could look at that's not about product A versus product B, but really is about asking fundamental questions like endpoints. How do we get better endpoints in the neuroscience area? Former Speaker Gingrich talked about the neurosciences. To me, we need some really practical research on getting better endpoints. And we could start to look at that even in our control group data. We could look at disease progression. We could look at placebo effects. We could look at aggregation of data across type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes and ask some fundamental questions like glycemic control versus hemoglobin A1C. And I really think that a key to changing the conversation, even at the level of the individual sponsor review, which is clearly something that we hear about a lot, goes to this whole issue of creating mutual respect and collaboration around sharing complex scientific information and differing perspectives, where it's often not clear what the science is telling us. So I guess in sum, I would say we're out there actively engaging the companies. Right now, we're doing a number of CEO listening sessions. We're really trying to get out there with the patient community and with the academic community to figure out how we as an agency can be sort of a neutral broker and a giant resource of scientific information, which isn't traditionally part of the scientific community conversation, and start to create some new models around sharing information.
Vicky, thanks for that perspective. Lou, you've studied a lot of these kinds of payment reforms and their impact on innovation, how they're being used. Some thoughts on the measurement issues and the challenges?
Yeah, Mark, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I should say I'm coming from an academic perspective, so probably, though I did work in industry for 12 years before that, so a mix of that, but I've been trying to measure value for 20 years, I mean, for a long time, and just like all economists and other economists in the room. And no one's really actually said, well, how do we measure value, and what does that have to do with innovation? So I want to try to just offer some thoughts about that. I'll talk about, review some basic economics that I think we need to keep in mind, talk about their attempt to measure value-based pricing in the United Kingdom, and then say a bit about the risk-sharing schemes and coverage with evidence development. The speaker hit upon this, but I think we need to remember that information and knowledge is a public good, and it's a global public good. We talked about the HIV drugs benefiting people globally. So that's very important to keep that in mind. Public goods, by economic theory, are undersupplied by an unregulated private market. So hence we create incentives around pull incentives like a patent system to sort of incentivize innovation. We have push incentives like the NIH and NSF. We subsidize basic research. And I would just say, as an aside, I think we've talked about comparative effectiveness research as a public good. It is, and we need to know what works. But we also have public good aspects around the basic science, and we've been talking about both of those things, and both of those are in need of these incentives to really improve innovation. Now, how do we measure value? Well, it's difficult to do. In the field of pharmacoeconomics that I've worked in, we've developed a methodology with a lot of limitations, and I think you'll see that's currently the main tool that we have at the moment. It's important to recognize the limitations, but if we're going to start thinking about how we can improve that to stimulate innovation, we're going to have to think about how we're going to modify that methodology. Okay, so the methodology is called cost utility analysis. As people said, we're concerned about improving health outcomes, and we're concerned about reducing costs, at least in the short run, and in the long term eventually. So the outcomes measure you've probably heard of is the quality adjusted life year. It measures length of life and improvements in patient morbidity, combines that into a single index, and that allows us to compare outcomes across different technologies. Okay. Now, this is used extensively in pharmacoeconomics. It's probably easiest to apply it there. It's much more difficult to think about applying it in reimbursing physician care or in hospital care. And there we have the resource-based relative value scale for physicians and DRGs for inpatient care, which are essentially cost-based administered pricing systems, and really not well aligned with value. So maybe we do a better job of capturing value in the pharmaceutical sector, at least in terms of measuring it. So we also need to think about sort of short-term static efficiency and long-term dynamic efficiency. And I think economists have increasingly brought out this idea. Our current system basically says, let's look at the current price, and someone talked about kind of the silo budget mentality. Let's just look at the drug budget. So we have this limited perspective that we look at the current price and we say, well, is it in the current situation, would this product be cost effective? But we're not looking down the long road, thinking about, well, when it goes off patent and the price falls to long-term cost, when we look at it over decades, would the product be considered cost effective? And I think when we have that point of view, actually a lot of the things we're looking at eventually become cost reducing when we look at it in that time scale. So I mean, the point about dynamic efficiency is that it's the idea where we need to ask, not just is it cost effective today, but are we eliciting the optimal amount of innovation, both in comparative effectiveness research and in basic science research. So, and as I've said before, we really need to have push and pull incentives to do that. Now, in our system, currently we have free pricing for drugs. In other countries, there's negotiated pricing with governments. Now, in the UK, they currently have free pricing, but they're talking about moving to a system of negotiated pricing, and they're calling it value-based pricing. And how are they going to do that? And I think that's to be defined, but they're certainly starting with the idea of building on the current system that they use there, that's run by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, called NICE, and that institute essentially uses a threshold for the QALY of 20 to 30,000 pounds per QALY, which effectively becomes a value-based price. So people have said, well, we essentially have value-based pricing in the UK. But what's happened over time, they've realized some of the limitations of the quality measurement, some of the limitations of that system, and they've made adjustments for orphan diseases, for end-of-life treatments, and improving patient rapid access. But they're still looking to try to get at how do we measure the innovation premium, okay? And I think it's important to recognize, and I think in the global public good sense, that we're talking about paying for the innovations, what they deliver today. But the important thing about science is it's cumulative, and there are spillovers to other areas. So one of the things about the patent system is we have this quid pro quo that you have to reveal the information about your technology. Well, that makes it cumulative. That essentially allows for spillovers and externalities to other fields. So somehow we need to in rewarding value, think about, is there a premium that we should pay for scientific novelty, for those potential spillover effects? And we shouldn't just take this very short-term view as what is it getting us today. Now, I just have a few seconds left, but I would just mention that at the University of Washington, we have a database around these risk-sharing agreements and CED. We've basically tracked about 97 agreements over the last 12 years. The majority of them are in the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, so and a lot of them they're increasingly moving to coverage with evidence development. I think when people have implemented things like the Velcade scheme in the UK and the multiple sclerosis scheme, we really come to recognize there are a lot of barriers to implementing them. There are a lot of transactions costs, a lot of it's not that easy to pull these off, and it will be a limited number of circumstances where we can use them, but they will provide valuable information. So. I think I think we need to recognize the barriers and see the potential there, but it's too early to tell if that's going to really just be have a major impact on the way we deliver care. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ubi. A good set of points to come back to. Sean, let me turn to you, both in your work at Medicare and now at the Center for Medicine and Technology Policy. You've had a lot of opportunities to work on data and measurement around the impact of medical innovations on both outcomes and costs. So looking forward to hearing your perspective.
Good. Well, thanks also for the invitation. When I walked in this morning, I heard Speaker Gingrich talking about, massive innovation and not thinking incrementally, and he talked about, Henry Ford and the Wright brothers, and my heart kind of sank because I'm definitely thinking, steam locomotive and shoveling coal. So, someday I'll think about how to reinvent the FDA, but I have to talk to Vicky about that first. But so just a really kind of, in a sense, a simple piece of this puzzle, which I think in some sense actually has a solution that's not too ethereal, which is, when I think about innovation and value, what, a common feature, in sort of defining value is, what health benefits are achieved at what cost. That's a simple, non-economist version of value, but, part of that equation is around health benefits or improvement in health outcomes. And I think you can't really think about innovation outside of the context of what leads to important health benefits in the future. And so what I wanted to talk about the fact is that we're pretty dysfunctional when it comes to just a common understanding of what are important health outcomes. And without being able to sort of define that clearly and consistently across the health system, it's very hard to then talk about how do you reward value, how do you incentivize innovation. And so what I was going to use as an illustration of this is a kind of a simple example of the case of psoriasis and what are important health outcomes when it comes to drugs for psoriasis. Primary endpoints for approval of drugs for psoriasis is a clinician judgment about the severity of the disease, the extent of the disease, thickness, plaque, et cetera. The Food and Drug Administration, the division that reviews these, won't consider any patient-reported outcomes at all, as a meaningful outcome that can potentially even be included on the label. So from the FDA's point of view, whatever a patient might report as a meaningful benefit from an innovation it's not going to be studied because it can't be reported on the label. The EMA actually has a bunch of different patient-reported outcomes for psoriasis that they've included on various labels, but they'll just essentially look at whatever a product developer brings in, and so the outcomes that are actually included in the label are sort of all over the map, but they're not consistently reported across any products. There was an interesting discussion at the National Institute of Clinical Excellence about psoriasis when they were looking at NICE approval of these drugs. They actually talked to patient groups, and it turns out what's really important to patients when it comes to psoriasis is the severity of the impact on the face and on joints. And there are no measures of facial involvement and joint involvement in any of the trials. There's actually no validated outcome measure of what actually is most important to patients. Why do you think that is? Well, nobody ever bothered to ask the patients before they started to develop the outcome measures. The outcome measures, as I understand it, were developed by a bunch of psoriasis docs who got around a table and sort of came up with what they thought might be important to patients, and then that became the validated outcome. So that's what we know about psoriasis drugs. Then if you go to any of a number of different payers and ask them what are the important outcomes, the usual response of the payers is, well, bring us what you got and we'll tell you if it's good enough. And usually in that circumstance, whatever you've got is just about good enough, but not quite good enough. That's, when you're looking at things backward, it's always, oh, you were so close. It was mentioned here that, I think, Rob, you mentioned it, that, you're inviting companies to come in and talk about, well, what might be important outcomes to measure in trials. And I heard a report from one of your employees, actually, who said, basically ran himself ragged running around the world talking to payers trying to find out what were important outcomes to report for rheumatoid arthritis. It actually seems to me that this is not an insurmountable or impossible problem, but it requires a kind of a dialogue at a very, in-the-weeds level, starting with what actually matters to patients, figuring out do we or don't we have validated measures that can be reported for those things, come to some agreement between across payers, but also with the regulators about what are important outcomes, and perhaps even some wiggle room about what can be reported, by the, if they're going to do these trials, that they can actually, with meaningful health outcomes, they can actually report those things as opposed to being prohibited by marketing rules from being able to report those outcomes. But it seems to me until we've developed a process for identifying what are important health outcomes, being able to measure them consistently across trials, and then have the key decision makers, both regulators and payers, harmonized and aligned around those things, we're just going to have a cacophony of information, and there's no possibility, in my view, of then really thinking intelligently about value or innovation to the extent that value actually depends on being able to measure meaningful outcomes to patients. So I think that dialogue and that process can really be done. It's not rocket science, but it does require folks who don't usually talk together about this sort of thing to actually work together to come up with that.
Well, let me pick up on that, Sean, and open this up to the rest of you on the panel. Look, it seemed like there were some common themes in what you all said about both the importance of having better information on outcomes and the potential for developing that through public-private partnerships, through better common understanding of the most important information to collect and then working together to collect it through using some of the newer infrastructures, electronic data systems and the like to make that happen. Seems like a big set of challenges, especially around the longer-term outcomes, the spillover effects from truly innovative technologies that may have many more benefits outside of their own disease and application initially. Those are hard challenges, but it sounds like you all think there are some steps that can be taken now to address them. I'd just like to get some follow-up comments from some of you about this.
Yeah. Well, I would just say that, as you can, I think it's going to be very difficult to measure spillovers to other things. I mean, and so maybe there's just some sort of we may just say that there's an average premium for scientific innovation that we want to award. And I don't know how we would implement that, but if we do use the kind of value methodology that we use in our field at the moment, it may underestimate the ultimate value, is what I'm saying. But we also know there are other problems. So you can think of, I've worked in the case of Herceptin, where the lesson there was that the mechanism was identified in 1984. We didn't have an indication until 1998. That was metastatic. It was considered to be a borderline cost effectiveness, and the UK didn't approve it initially. And then, 8 years later, 2006, there's an indication for adjuvant breast cancer, very cost effective at the current price. So in a sense, the company had set the price too low. The innovation reward for the subsequent indication was too low. So we face the problem, even in the simple case of one drug and two indications, of how are we going to pay for the value, or do we have a system that will be flexible enough? And I think we need to think about that if we want to reward innovation. So,
I guess I'd come back to some of Sean's point. I mean, I think patient-reported outcomes are critical, and we definitely need to find better ways to understand the patient experience. And I think it's not just PROs. I mean, I think it's also going to be better, accurate, objective measures also of disease and disease progression in the post-market setting. So part of the challenge, is I think also from the consumer perspective is a drug is under an NDA, it gets approved one day, nothing's fundamentally changed about that drug between one day pre-approval and one day post-approval, and yet the perception is dramatically changed into what the safety profile of that drug is and what the potential benefit is. So I think, a large part of this is going to be engaging in a discussion with patients, not just about what they care about, but also this whole issue of risk-benefit. And, to me, this is going to be medical society by medical society. The physicians need to be engaged. The patient groups need to be engaged because it's one of the other major issues underlying some of the challenges, I think, in the payer community, but also certainly as a regulatory agency, is trying to sort through that whole risk-benefit equation. I also think we need better markers, objective markers. We definitely, beyond the PRO side, which we definitely need to find ways to gather and get information, again, in my view, we really need to work hard on markers for predictive tox. This is one of the major issues confronting the post-market world now, and I think as data sources become increasingly available to academics and other people are going to be looking at outcomes databases, they're going to find signals. They are going to find safety signals. And then the question becomes, what's the truth and who adjudicates it? And, in my mind, as a regulatory agency, the tools that you have available to you once you identify a signal are not necessarily subtle and have major implications. And what we all really want are markers for people to define people who are at risk for cardiovascular toxicity or who are at risk for liver toxicity. And we just don't have those. So again, I don't think we're going to get it from an individual sponsor. This is a collective issue that needs to be addressed by all parties involved. I think it needs to be the companies, it needs to be academia, it needs to be payers probably, and it needs to be, the regulatory agencies. And just tackling that issue, I think, will have a significant impact on both the pre and post-market medical product development costs in the pre-market, but also what happens once a drug gets out on the market.
I'll just say, I agree with that. I think one comment I was going to make, because Mark, you referred to it a couple of times about this, just sort of the data infrastructure, right? People have talked about registries and using, administrative data and their Sentinel and all this stuff. One thing that I worry about is the creation of the infrastructure, which is, so sexy because there's so much information there already, not necessarily aligning up with those things that we really are essential to know, like the biomarker information or the PRO information or the things, that really matter in terms of decision making, because we can create infrastructure that provides information which it's hard to know how to interpret it in terms of comparative effectiveness, just because it hasn't been designed in with that notion of, well, what do the end users actually really need to know? What are the payers, patients, and clinicians? So all I'm saying is it feels to me like before we get too far ahead in the frontier of, creating the infrastructure, we need to make sure that we're simultaneously really thinking carefully about what is it that we absolutely have to know. And if it turns out that, just to go back to the psoriasis example, is what we need to know is how badly the face and joints are involved, because otherwise it's senseless to try to compare products. Then you can't just hope that, infrastructure that doesn't have that information is never going to be useful. So you have to really, unfortunately, I think, at least start with the conversation of what do people really need to know to make good decisions.
And I would add, I think, the thing that small companies and startups face that we would trade probably, and I could speak for myself, is unpredictability and uncertainty. Those are the things that kill little companies, in the sense that both from the regulatory, reimbursement, and patent side, those are all things that make it hard to raise money. So in terms of this idea of sharing information, I think a lot of little companies would share some more of their information or what they're seeing or what they're doing if there was a flip side, some predictability could be guaranteed to them in terms of the process that they would have to follow along any of these paths, which represent uncertainty to both their investors. I mean, things that are important to small companies are the burn. Every day that goes by is burn, is money that I don't have for the next day, that I have to go raise. So I think the difference is also trying to figure out not only what information is important, but what's the most efficient information on a reasonable timeline. Because I think, the speed of startups versus the speed of government are very different. But startups don't have unlimited funds or taxpayers or to fund us. So I think I do think there is it's a little facetious, but it's true. I think one of the things that could be of help to, I think, to a lot of innovative companies is payers know what they'd like to see. Are there any guidelines that you can put out that would say, like, if you can do this and, pick something easy as a model or a pilot, because I can propose all the things I want and another company proposes all the things they want. But if at least the payers say, if you do this, this, and this over this period of time, at least that's a starting point for some dialogue. Because otherwise, it seems that, small companies feel that payers would love young patients who never use the health system or old people who may die suddenly. And then that's perfect. That's perfect. But that's not the U.S. healthcare system. The U.S. healthcare system is about improving health and valuing the productivity. So I would say that if there's a way that payers could actually come to the table with that sort of a approach, it would really help small companies understand why how they could contribute to that.
And that fits back with the discussion we had on the previous panel, too. I'd like to open this up to a few comments from in the audience. So maybe start up here. Joel, you already had one turn, so maybe in a minute.
Thank you, Mark. I want to ask a question on a significant societal issue, which is the issue of soldiers with traumatic brain injury, to follow up on Speaker Gingrich's speech this morning, because we're talking in this long war of at least probably 150 to 200,000 of our soldiers being faced with TBI. So my question is, how do we accelerate development of both biomarkers and treatments for TBI, which would be of considerable use to our military and the VA? And how do we do that through this public-private partnership that Vicky talks about.
Yeah, Vicky, maybe if you could start with that. That does fit with your comment earlier about the need for better markers in neuroscience for showing when we are actually having beneficial effects.
Well, it's interesting. I just had a conversation with the president of Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Robert Tejan. We had an opportunity to meet with him. And I don't know if many of you know, there's this really amazing neuroscience institute called Genelia Farms over in Virginia. And, I posed the question. I said, what are you guys working on over there? They're working on all kinds of cool neural networks and all kinds of really innovative stuff, both from the computational side and also from the basic science side. And I said, how would you feel if we came in as the FDA and sort of posed to you what are some of the big problems confronting clinical trial development now in antidepressants or mental health disease or some of the neuroscience-mediated disease? And what if we started thinking about taking some of that incredible brain power and channeling it to start to address some very practical issues that are confronting real product development in the real world today? And so we're going to engage in a dialogue about that. And he was very open and interested. I really think this is going to be, in large part, identifying problems and then taking a more engineering approach, which is identify the problem and assemble the group of people to work together to solve it. And sort of project by project, bit by bit, I think we're going to have to tackle some of these things. But I also think we need to keep in mind learning what we can from our past experiences, which is why I talked about the data asset. And also, I think it will be important by engaging these diverse communities, there'll be a change in the conversation. I really think there will, in terms of different perspectives being brought to bear on some of these problems that have currently been done in a very sort of linear, siloed fashion. It's academia, and then they throw that over to industry, who then throws it over to the regulatory agency, who then throws it over to the payer, who then throws it over to the physician, and then to the patient. And it doesn't work very well, because each of them has a very important part to play in solving the problem.
Thanks. We have time for one more. Joel?
I'll change my comment to make it relevant to this.
Okay.
But another problem is, and we face this both with TBI and PTSD, which are two of our highest interests, is the market is small. And it's not like hypertension. And commercial development here is, we really have to encourage people. And to give you another example, the upper arm prosthesis is not a very common, upper arm injuries now are not very common, except in battle. And fortunately, DARPA and us took this on as a problem. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And I think it's been mentioned with shrinking markets with genomics and small markets for for various rare diseases. But even some reasonably common but not gigantically common things, I think that's a problem. So the government has to do a lot of this. And we don't have enough money to do all of it, but I think it's going to be important. Can I make one more comment? Just in general, I think that, since basically because some horrible things happened, there's been a divide between research and clinical care, and a research subject and a patient. Now, with databases, coverage with evidence, that we're working on point-of-care research where people remain in the healthcare system and are randomized, that's changing. And it's going to require a whole new policy foundation to do that. Privacy issues, all kinds of issues will come up when we try to make a patient a research subject. And I think that's important to think about.
Well, that does seem like where we're, any final comments on that? That does seem like where we're headed. If with this emphasis, as Sean described, on patient-focused outcomes with the payment reforms that Reed and others talked about on the payer side, focusing on how do we get better results for patients at a lower cost, this is coming into much more focus around the patient, around data that involves the patient's ongoing care. Any final comments on this?
I was just going to mention, related to this, rare diseases that are important public health issues like traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. This model that's been used in the global community, the advanced market commitments, which I'm sure you know more about than I do, but this notion of not just counting on government support, but actually creating contractual arrangements where, if you hit certain benchmarks in terms of being able to create technologies and treatments that address these problems, there's a sort of a guaranteed reward that's sufficient to stimulate.
Gates Foundation, Gavi, others have worked on this.
Yeah.
But I mean, we should be willing to pay more for value in certain circumstances, and we should think about that. So.
All right, great point to end on. Thank you all very much for the discussion. Thank you.